Hey everyone. So welcome to this conference, and thanks so much for being here. I'm Rebecca Liao. I'm co-founder and CEO at Saga, which is a Web3 protocol. And it's my distinct honor to be moderating this panel today on DAOs and the future of work and identity. And I'm going to turn it over real quick to my fellow panelists because their work, their lives, and their thoughts are far more interesting than mine. But to set the groundwork, just wanted to first of all define what a DAO is, because we don't want to jump into all these Web3 and crypto concepts without having done some sort of preliminary definition. So what is a DAO? DAO is an acronym, DAO. It stands for Decentralized Autonomous Organization. And the idea behind a DAO is that we, as lawyers, we know all about entities, we know all about corporations, and those sort of more traditional forms of organizations. What a DAO is it tries to take a lot of the processes and decision-making rhythms out of an organization, out of the people of an organization, and tries to execute it through smart contracts instead. So a lot of these processes that we're accustomed to in terms of checks and balances, being able to disperse funds, being able to reward your employees or your contractors for work, that is all taken care of via smart contract as opposed to by an army of people. That's the simplest way to think of a DAO. Although ever since DAOs were introduced a few years ago as a concept in crypto and Web3, they have advanced significantly, and now it's a much more fluid definition and way of categorizing what qualifies a project as a DAO. But people on the panel will have lots of thoughts on that. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go down the row here and if everyone could please introduce themselves briefly. I know if we were to just stay on introductions, we could be here all day. But if you could say who you are, what you're working on, and also what excites you most about the DAO space, then I think we can get things kicked off. So Tony, please.
Thank you, Rebecca. Hello, everyone. Lovely to be here. And thank you very much to the last panel for an incredible conversation. I hope we can sort of build in and weave into some of the aspects that were brought up, especially around political economy. And I think that's one of the reasons why I'm so interested and excited about DAOs. Just a quick background, I had a career as a lawyer for many years until I came to Stanford and then got into legal technology as part of the Codex Stanford Center here. For the last 10 years, I've been a fellow. It's been incredible to be a part of the community. As part of that, found my co-founder for Legal.io, which is a company that's looking at the future of legal technology, particularly around the future of legal careers and how technology weaves into legal careers going forward. For the last 3 years, I've been really focusing in on the blockchain work around law and policy here at Codex. And so we have a blockchain working group, which meets every month on a regular basis, and various projects have come out of that, including the Journal for Blockchain Law and Policy, which is the first academic journal focusing on this area. So as I said, one of the reasons I'm really excited is about the nature of political economy when we start thinking about the future of work and the future of identity and what it means to actually be able to coordinate and organize around different kinds of business models, essentially. So business models, ethical models, ways in which we create commons and approach the different tools that are available for us to not necessarily dominate and influence, but to coordinate and coalesce. And I think the aspects of the use of force and the sort of use of enforcement as part of creating these coordinatory mechanisms has been the ways that most states and sort of human societies, in one interpretation of history, how that's mainly been interpreted. And I think that the prospect of DAOs maybe taps into this other approach to coordination, which is very much around control of information, control of knowledge, versus the control of force. And as lawyers, who hopefully believe that the pen is mightier than the sword, I think DAOs represent this huge area where lawyers can step up and really start shaping the political economy of the future based around some of these core principles that we as law students learned about right at the beginning.
Thank you, Tony. I didn't think we would start to get into questions of war and peace this early in the morning, but we will definitely return to that. Thank you. Silke, please.
Hi, I'm a crypto lawyer, mathematician, and have been the chief legal officer of Gnosis for the last for more than 4 years. And for the last 4 years, mainly actually initialized quite a lot of DAOs. I've worked on this topic since. I'm also one of the co-authors of the Koala Model Law on DAOs. What interests me most is in the DAO space, or what I find very exciting, and some actually call me a critic, although I have been in the space for a very long time, is the collective action that is possible through DAOs, what Tony also just alluded to, and impact DAOs. I recently helped setting up the Assange DAO, which raised 52 million for legal fees for Julian Assange. And in this process, you realize that a lot of the governance questions that come up have actually been dealt with 30 or 20, 30 years ago by others, and it doesn't make sense to always reinvent the wheel. So right now, what interests me most, and what I'm working on a PhD on the side, which is on decentralized justice, and I'm looking at how it is applied right now to inter-DAO relations and the metaverse.
Thanks so much, Silke. So I know the temptation is to just focus on your work for the Assange DAO, but the principles that you are bringing to the table there, I think they're applicable across so much of the other DAO work that you've been doing, and so I'm very excited to get into a lot of your practical experience there as well. So thank you. Henning, please.
Yeah, hello everybody. I'm Henning Dietrich. I'm a developer and inventor, mainly been hacking all my life, and I'm currently creating a human-readable programming language. It's inspired by smart contracts, by the idea, wouldn't it be awesome if everybody who's asked to enter into a contract, or a judge who's asked to synchronize the real world and the legal system with what is happening on the blockchain, if they could read what the smart contract says. So I created Lexon, and that is basically a language that is for smart contracts, but also for computational law, a programming language that anybody without any training in computer sciences can read. What interests me in DAOs, it's the long tail. I mean, it's that we have something here where also with a small margin that would usually be eaten up by trying to enforce the rules that you're writing down, something in the economic sphere can start to exist. And going back to War and Peace again, a milestone in having limited liability companies, having a vehicle to invest and then other people's basically to execute, was already set in old Rome, when it was basically ponying up, rich people ponying up for wars, and then the bounty being divided pro rata for how much was paid in by whom. So that's obviously something with a big margin, and that's how that's where we're coming from over thousands of years. But still, with the DAO, the fascinating thing is that now we can really create economic entities that can operate with a very small economic margin for things that people love, that is dear to people, and that might not be economically big enough for a connection to our existing legal system. So I think this is going to be a tremendous revolutionary force for our society. And I like what Brent Mayer said in a Wyoming drafting session for the Wyoming law for LLCs that are DAOs. He said, we basically need 1 billion DAOs to be able to go to Mars. And how I understand that is we have to leverage this long tail of human ingenuity and commercial activity to be able to go to the next step in our cultural development. So in that sense, to me, DAOs are a huge hope for change to the better in the world.
Thanks so much, Henning. Wow, that's an incredible idea to think about, is that a thing like a venture to Mars or anything that's similarly significant would take a huge capital investment. It still would, but the idea that it could be executed through a decentralized network of enthusiasts for people who also want to go to Mars is just, I mean, that's an incredible idea. So we'd definitely love to explore that further. Thank you. Professor Liu, please.
Yes, my name is Jerry Liu. I graduated from Stanford over here, actually, a few years ago with a JSD degree. Then I started teaching in a couple of US law schools. I recently become all-in Web 3.0 and co-founded a project trying to combine, actually trying to reconcile intellectual property with NFTs, right? And we all know blockchain innovations such as NFT and the DAO provide new ways to creativity, right? Like crowdfunding creative projects or crowdsourcing a creative collaboration, right? But it appears that IP law ramifications have been generally understudied in the blockchain community so far. So hopefully we can do a quick, 5 or 10 minutes discussion about key IP issues involving blockchain. So I will kick off with the first question. So who can mint an NFT representing a copyrighted work, like a visual art, music, video, right? The easy answer is author and other IP owners, right? But do third parties need a copyright license to mint NFT? So as a matter of fact, the technical process of minting NFTs does not have to require any copyright activity like reproduction, distribution, or display. An NFT is essentially a series of digits, right, created by smart contracts on-chain. Although the hash value of an image can be readily stored on-chain, the actual image is usually stored off-chain, either through a centralized server like AWS or decentralized system like IPFS, right? So smart contracts based on ERC 721 or 1155 only incorporate a URL directing to the image stored off-chain. So although an image stored off-chain can certainly become an infringing copy, NFT itself is not an infringing copy in any legal sense. So there's also another reason why an NFT may or may not need a copyright license. Certain images in NFTs are automatically generated by algorithm that randomly allocated a limited number of features, such as races, facial features, accessories, right? CryptoPunks is a typical example, right? And such NFT may not result in copyrighted work for two reasons. First of all, the US Copyright Office has recently rejected the registration of AI-generated works on the premises that only human instead of machine can be authors of copyrighted works. Secondly, a mechanical process initiated by algorithm may not have sufficient creativity needed for copyright protection. So I will stop here. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Professor Liu. So, I mean, all different exciting topics here, and I know we're in law school, but we're going to resist the temptation to just do issue spotting because we could do that all day long. But a DAO, as you can see, it really is a new form of organization that allows people to coordinate work efforts, and so some people who want to hype it up, they call it the new corporation or the new company. So for a lot of people who are working in Web3, a DAO is what they work for. And certainly a lot of the principles that inform DAOs can also start to translate into the non-Web3 or Web2 or analog world. So keeping on that theme, because I think all the panelists touched upon it, we have this idea of a DAO and all the possibilities that come with it. So you could have 1,000 DAOs coordinating to get to Mars. You can have DAOs engaging in collective action in order to arrive at some sort of decentralized justice. Tony was talking about the control of information and knowledge. Where does that information knowledge come from? It comes from the contributors to the DAO. And so I guess I would love for the panelists to think a little bit about what does working in a DAO mean about the future of work. One analogy that Tony talked about on the prep call yesterday, which I thought was really resonant, was imagine that Apple and Microsoft were DAOs. then all of a sudden this is just going to happen, regardless of what the lawyers or HR try to do. 40% of Microsoft is going to work for Apple. Just because some of the contributors to Microsoft think, oh, Apple's working on this really cool product. I'm really passionate about it. And I really, frankly, do not care. That's part of the ethos of DAOs. I do not care that I work for this other project that might be competitive. This product, this technology, maybe this team of people really excites me, and I want to collaborate with them. So you're starting to see a lot more fluidity between organizations as a result of this decentralization. So I would just love to hear from the panel, what do you think that means for the future of how we work?
So maybe I can pick up first off this.
Go for it, please.
I think it comes back to this idea of control and ownership that was brought up in the previous panel. It's very much around the notion of agency to work for and in line with your own values and passions. And it's one of the biggest things that I get as a takeaway from talking to people who are all in on this space, or who are even just like coming in early on and sort of like, you know, getting a sense of the culture of how people work together. And a big part of it is this notion of voice and exit, which is sort of like very embedded in the space. This idea that you, one, can speak up and reason and have this transparent view into all of the rules and the sort of political decisions that are being made to some extent, but also this idea that you are pretty much free to leave at any time, and that therefore the people who are still there are people who are actively wanting to be there because of the agency or the passion that they're actually able to find and align with. And so this notion that you're not really doing anything because people are like ordering you to do something, but you're doing it because like there's like active contributory participatory agency that you can be activating. I think that's one of the biggest pieces around like the future of work, and to some extent the future of identity as well, with this space, is like that ability to step in and then find both your self-identity, but in various different ways find a multiplicity of collective identities that you can align with as well. And so this leads to this notion that, you know, 40% of Microsoft might be working at the same time for Apple, which I think is just a really interesting future of work potential to be thinking about. And I think there's a lot of legal issues that go around that in terms of competition and various things that Sophia and I have been digging on. But yeah, it's still a fascinating in terms of the opportunity space that creates for people.
Absolutely. Sophia, did you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think actually the wording like working for a DAO, it's not really, you're not really working for the DAO. What you're doing is you're working in the DAO or with the DAO, because you have, I mean, for whatever project you do, usually the way people work with DAOs is they put a proposal up and say, hey, I'm going to do this for you and I'm going to charge that and you're going to pay me that either in stages, or basically it's usually you who makes the proposal or has quite a high impact on it, and it's very much project based, so you keep more agency, which I think is generally better for people working in organizations. However, I mean, also to the legal issues you have with that is that a lot of DAO workers are very in a way that there's a risk for them to be in a precarious situation. And I've spoken to several friends who've been working, especially in the last 2 years during the pandemic, for DAOs. And what some of them say is, you know, I'm so tired of working for a DAO. I just want to have a normal job that pays me, you know, on that date and that gives me all the health insurance. So what we're going to see, the DAOs, they're not going to go away, but we're going to see more organizations that are going to support DAOs, which we already have with the POAs, especially to deal with problems that exist in some jurisdictions. So in the US, for example, you have healthcare, which is a big problem. Whereas, I mean, in France or in Germany, where I reside at the moment, this isn't really that much of a big issue. No one talks about that because there is no problem with pre-existing conditions or so. So I think you're going to see more and more DAOs actually spring up that deal with this. But some of these DAOs, they're not real DAOs because they need to, I don't want to say real DAOs, but it's a real DAO anyway. But they will have like some instantiation in the meat space, the legacy system. to deal with these employment-related issues that can come up. So I think for some people it's really nice, but then some others, they find it very hard to actually work in DAOs and with DAOs.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that is a theme that we keep hearing, just in terms of practical experience. That, and we'll get to this later as well. But people are people at the end of the day, and organizational dynamics. Some of them are part and parcel of the corporate form, but oftentimes they're just a result of people getting together and trying to coordinate to execute on a project. And so a lot of those dynamics they don't go away simply because you're now in a DAO. But let's expand upon that a little bit, because so Henning, I can't get this image out of my head of 1,000 DAOs coming together to get to Mars. So you have some people who would be a part of that effort, who are bought into the DAO ethos and really want to be a part of collective action. And then you have really brilliant, capable scientists, let's say, who want to work in an academic environment, or they want to work for an institution like NASA. So how does that all work together, do you think?
Yeah, thank you for describing the spectrum really that we're talking about here. I mean, on the one hand, it's stuff where a DAO can organize stuff that is in the gray area or maybe completely illegal. On the other hand, working on something like Lexon, where the actual rules of the DAO become transparent, so that everybody can understand what the actual algorithms are that govern that DAO, also has the advantage that it becomes transparent for the legal system, so to say. And so I am very interested in that aspect where you use the DAO for incorporating an LLC, for example, like the Wyoming legislation is now making possible, and have a effect where it's just by shaving off a lot of overhead that comes to just be able to found a company is taken out by a DAO having rules that are such that you cannot make certain mistakes. Because regulation often is stifling for two reasons. For one, it is crafted in a way that it makes innovation impossible, often inadvertently. That was not really the intention, but it happens. But there's also the part where the administration is just burdensome. Even if what you want to do is completely within the allowable realm, it's completely in the white, so to say, you might still, as an entrepreneur, stumble and fall and not give the world your innovation because you just fail to be able to just go through all the hoops that are necessary to be compliant. So both of these elements can be addressed by DAOs in a very powerful way. And I'm really interested in the way that I wouldn't even care if you call what the attribute is, whether it's with or in the DAO or so on, but in the part where the DAO is, for example, an LLC. And it does exactly what an LLC does, just it does it with a lot less overhead. And the interesting thing to me is that a certain number of things, a certain number of mistakes can just not happen, because that is then the magic of smart contracts, of blockchain, right? It's not even the magic of decentralization in that moment. It's just there is a algorithm, it's programmed. And if you have the voting, for example, like the vanilla stuff, like if you vote for a new CEO, or so, right, and the new manager. There is just no way that the vote can go wrong if the capacities of managers themselves are related to the smart contract and the DAO itself. So there's no way that a vote gets lost, or a rule is bent, or somebody is forgetting something and oops, it has a different outcome than expected or anything. So, and this is taking out so much possible friction just within the boring white space, right, within normal administrative tasks, that I think that is also going to be a super powerful transformational aspect that is going to make the difference of working for a DAO or not working for a DAO, especially where you see an LLC, for example, is something where people come together. It's usually a small number of people, and they want to do something together in a partnership, and that is exactly the form how innovation happens. And so I think that can be a very powerful element of what a DAO can bring to the existing landscape of legal forms of incorporation.
Absolutely. No, that's fascinating. And before I get to you, Professor Liu, Henning, you're adding an additional dimension to this that I think would be really interesting to explore, which is that DAOs are governed by smart contracts, and there's still usually some sort of, I wouldn't want to call it committee, that makes it sound quite formal, but there's usually a group of people who end up doing a lot of work in the DAO. Just very naturally, they are the core contributors to the DAO, and proposals might come from them, or proposals might be evaluated by them. They may end up just being the most active members, actually running this collective. And what we're seeing in practice is that the decisions that are made by this core group or by the people who are known to be, say, the largest token holders in this DAO, the decisions that are made by them versus decisions that need to go to the community for a vote, the categorization is not yet clear. And so what's interesting for those of us who have had a lot of experience in the corporate world, let's say, is sometimes decisions that have a lot of impact. So, for example, is this sort of category of contributors going to get paid to put on a project onto the protocol that we're building? I mean, that sounds like a much bigger decision, but that might be made by a small core group of people versus, well, we think that our protocol it needs updating. Just from a technology perspective, it is no longer the most cutting edge model out there, and therefore we need to explore getting onto another backend, for instance. Those votes that you think are generally sort of back office IT decisions get put to the entire community. And so I think the governance is still being worked out in many ways. But how do you think this is going to land? Are we, not to keep on a theme of skepticism, but are we going to land in sort of the same place that a lot of corporations currently operate, or are we going to see a lot more fluidity there? So, do you have an opinion?
I do have an opinion on this, and I don't want to be overly critical on it. Mm-hmm. But what's happening right now, and I think this is going to change. So right now, it's happening in a lot of DAOs is these important decisions. As who are the core members? You set up they have calls. Like the DAO members usually not included. On like, oh, is this a good idea? You speak to the people who are the whales in the system, who basically have all the votes. And so you have a lot of backdoor discussions. Like we're tooting a lot like the transparency of the DAO, and then it's true. In the end, there will be this proposal and everyone can look at it and everyone can comment on it. But prior to that, you usually already have these discussions. So you see a lot of like intransparency in a very transparent system. I think there will be obviously changes, and the more technical or the more technically advanced the smart contract system becomes, and actually in 2017 we had very good smart contract systems with DAO stack. And actually, we kind of this went all back again. So in 22, you use a knows the safe, and that's probably my company's fault, which is a multi-signature wallet, and you set it up with a snapshot off-chain voting, which is much less, from a corporate law perspective, from principal agency problems, it's much more simplistic, and it has many, many more problems. I think we're going to go back to a much better system, but these governance problems, they have to be addressed, and they're being addressed right now. And the more lawyers are coming in also who know about this thing, who have been working on this for 20 years or more, the better. Because at the moment, you have simplistic voting systems where the voting is entirely public. So after 50% of the votes is in, the vote is over. Scholars have talked about for years that this is not a good idea of doing voting systems. And we will see also darker DAOs where you need to not have everything being transparent, especially with the lawyers. You hire a lawyer as a DAO. Who's going to deal with this? Who's taking over the fiduciary? What about the fiduciary duties?
Yeah.
So I think we're going to get there, but a lot of more help is needed from governance experts at this moment in time.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that. I mean, just a small anecdote of what happened recently is, so I designing a DAO right now where the project, the protocol, wants to convert into something that's fully decentralized. And so the core team has been working on this project for a long time, and now they'd like to hand it over to the community for them to govern. And so what we arrived at as the most efficient way to do it was certain decisions would be given to the community, but we would also have essentially an operating committee of people that would be regularly elected. And then we came up with this idea that not everybody would be up for election at the same time. Maybe 3 people would be up for election at a given time. It'd sort of be a staggered term. And I was like, congratulations, this is a staggered board. So, sometimes you do sort of not entirely reinvent the wheel, but you come to very, very similar concepts. So this actually is a nice segue into the second major topic we wanted to talk about with respect to DAOs, which is identity. So we started to talk about the governance piece and contributors being able to work on things that they're just passionate about. What happens when you don't know who these contributors are? Because we talk so much about AML KYC when it comes to financial services, and there's a whole regulatory regime to comply with there. But what happens if you have incredibly talented people who want to work in this DAO, and they are what is known in the industry as anonymous? They are nothing more than an image that it's not of their face. It's probably a cartoon. And maybe an Ethereum address or some sort of fake name. But they're very talented, and they seem to be reliable. But you have no idea who they are. They have no interest in revealing who they are. But over time, you can see that this becomes a very important contributor. They will become a part of governance because they are an important contributor. So how do we start thinking about identity in a work context? Yes, but also in the context of DAOs just being the foundation of the metaverse, where we all have digital identity and we live a digital life. How do we start to think about organizing identity in such a way that it continues to be a meaningful object? It becomes is still a meaningful identifier and provides the function it's meant to provide in this digital world.
If I might have a shot at this first,
Yes,
I think one of the interesting things about DAOs and this idea of being able to approach work around the things that you're truly aligned with is the idea that you can bring your full identity to a work environment or even a living environment. Oftentimes with organizations that we've had so far, you sort of think about institutions as being a sort of perspective on you as sort of fulfilling a role, and you sort of operate via certain rules as part of fulfilling that role. Whereas in a DAO, you're much more sort of encouraged to bring your identity across all the different spectrums. And then it's more about the relationships that you build, because at the end of the day, you're bringing your whole self. You can sort of pick and choose from multiple roles, and you might wear multiple hats in that sense. And so you start looking then at this idea of how do we sort of compose identity? How is identity coalesced in various different ways? And then we were talking about digital assets as these sort of markers or sort of nodes around which identity can be constructed. And then we start thinking about NFTs and IP and like the ways in which NFTs can be assigned to your wallet, and that even the notion that we can start bridging the physical world and the metaverse, like all of the various things that you might want to be seen as contributing in the real world. Let's say you've gone down to your local conservation land management a nonprofit, and you've like spent 10 hours there. And that can be represented, without people knowing who exactly you are, but the fact that you've actually done that, and that can be a part of your sort of composed identity in all of these situations. So I think that notion of being able to, one, have a greater ownership and control over identity, this notion of self-sovereign identity, is sort of like this key layer that it'll be interesting to see whether some of the Web 2 metaverse players start recognizing this sort of layer and, giving back ownership and control over identity to individuals and sort of like self-organizing collectives as part of this more ethical future, perhaps.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Henning, Professor Liu, I do have a follow-up question there, but I wanted to give you both a chance to speak on.
Yeah, I would like to say, go back to the roots here on the identity question. I remember having discussed that here in Stanford years back. There is this fundamentally different idea or concept of how identity works in the blockchain space, right? If we talk about identity and we have in mind how our system works, and I appreciate the completely, I'm just complimenting the technical side of it. Identity is usually something that the state can use to punish you if you have overstepped your allowances. And in the crypto world, which is by definition optional, so you don't have to take part in it, identity starts completely self-sovereign. It's expressed wonderfully in the metaphor that you can create yourself a blockchain identity without even interacting with the blockchain. You basically just throw the dice. And because you have a public-private key, then you have an identity. And you can give it to somebody else. They can even send you money, and you have still not ever interacted with Bitcoin or Ethereum, what have you, right? Because there's no registration there. You will, however, have the agency over the assets, and that's a completely complementary way of thinking of identity. And until now, I'm part of the discussions, again, in Wyoming about digital identity, and like Daza, we're juicing about questions that when you think that through, I mean, I remember we were talking for an hour or so about whether the word self-sovereign should be in the law, right? Or whether it's even what's intended, what's even meant. So this is really hard to reconcile, because the fundamental magic, of course, here of smart contracts, of blockchain, that the rules cannot be broken. Gives you a system that can do without the need to have an identity that you can use to go after somebody to punish them. And where it goes wrong, like with a catastrophe of the DAO, where in broad daylight there was a burglary that couldn't be stopped for hours. The money was siphoned out of the DAO back then. Yeah, then you can see the limitations of this approach. So to say, if there is a bug in the law, that is the code, and is that even a bug then, right? So it's a fundamentally different idea of identity that until now we are not really breaking into leveraging the power of this, because of course there's this inertia and there's a real fear probably. And I remember back then there was a regulator here that would just not have it at all, of course, right? That this could be identity. But this is how we talk about it in the blockchain space and crypto, right?
Yeah, and I like to highlight that there are at least two kinds of identities when we are talking about identities in the blockchain world, right? First one is the legal identity, right? Like your ID, right? Second is your personal identity, right? So there's an old saying, I probably don't remember quite precisely, but the old saying is that, you know, in the reality, right, in offline world, we know your name, but we don't really know who you are inside. But in the online world, in the crypto world, we don't know your name, but we know who you are inside, right? So actually, I think, you know, in terms of legal identity, it's really about legal responsibility, liabilities, right? And whether or not one can be culpable for wrongdoings online or on chain, right? That's about legal identity. But personal identity, I think one person can have multiple personal identities, right? In Second Life, in blockchain, in OpenSea, right, or in other, in Axie Infinity, right? We can have multiple identities and can express ourselves in multiple ways. I think totally fine. But I don't think, I do believe that it will be an illusion eventually that we can hide our legal identity on blockchain. As people said like 20 years ago, nobody knows you are a dog online, but eventually that's not true.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So the project I'm working on, it's based on the Cosmos protocol, and there recently was a huge controversy around a fellow project because there's this thing called an airdrop in crypto, which means that you airdrop, so you release tokens to your community for free. And why would you do that? Why would you give away utility tokens for free? Well, you would do that because you're trying to build community. So as these people become your token holders, hopefully they participate in your project. And something went wrong with that airdrop where someone or an entity, we don't really know, they exploited the airdrop and basically got gains that they shouldn't have. And it was a huge discussion within the DAO whether we should claw back these gains, because clearly it was an exploit of the code, or, you know, fair and square, this person identified that there was this loophole and exploited it, and it's our fault that we didn't write the code the right way, but this person should keep their gains. What's interesting is, at no point, just as an ethical matter, at no point during this debate did anyone ask this person to reveal who they were. And because everything is on the blockchain, tracking this person's transactions, they were able to find, okay, this person actually does have accounts on centralized exchanges. So they have a Coinbase account, they have an FTX account. We can figure out who this person is because they have to KYC into these exchanges. But that was considered the one thing you could not touch in this debate. People called each other all sorts of names, made all sorts of accusations about criminal activity, but the one thing you could not touch was outing who this person was. And so it's fascinating because based on this discussion, I wonder whether that part of crypto ethos and wanting that freedom, wanting to be able to have freedom of activity without people knowing who you are, or even if people know who you are, without barring you from things you want to do. I mean, is that something that you think is going to be a part of the greater metaverse that's not based on crypto? Is it just going to be a part of how we do digital life going forward? Any takers on that one?
I
or
take
should
it.
we pass?
So I think going forward, we will have this new type of identity. We will have anonymity again. Right now, there are a lot of forces that are skewing the image and the natural development of things, but we still have a very strong driver in the technological activity of the core blockchain scene, basically. And there are a lot of folks who just do what they want. They have the means to do it.
Yeah.
And in my experience, corporates have a very, very difficult time to replicate any progress or to stake their own claims in this field. I mean, if we just talk about another project, Libra, and talk about how it's not talked about a lot anymore. So this is just one famous project where you can see that it's difficult for a big corporate, and the drivers are really those who are leaning more in the other direction, right? And I think there's a flip going to happen between these two sides, where we can see that for the actual goals of corporate activity and for the actual goal of having corporate activity or commercial activity without the friction of criminal activity just killing it because it's harvesting the value out of it and you cannot protect it against it, we have a new means here. And it's similar, for example, where all the friction that we're seeing right now, of course, with the SEC and ICOs, for example, there's a very valid task the SEC has, and that is protecting people from fraud. And they have a very clear mechanism how they do this, and this is transparency. In the blockchain space, however, you could use a different mechanism, and that is transparency of the code, transparency of what it actually is that is being proposed. And you could, with that, have a much better, much more powerful regulation that was completely impossible before, right? But because now we can propose in the form of a DAO that is an enterprise exactly what it is doing. And to make it easier to imagine, it really starts with the bylaws or the operating agreement being a smart contract. And it defines exactly what bylaws do, right? How do you vote about the most essential things in this company, like who should be the leader, who's then free to do a lot of things, right? But these things are framed in the bylaws. And that's where it starts, very, very simply, right? And what you can do with this becoming unbreakable through blockchain technology, through DAOs being unstoppable, being untemperable in their mechanisms, that is what we're only about to discover. And there will be flips in how we, for example, protect consumers and how we what the expectation will be from identity. Now, existing mechanisms will not let go for quite some time, but these new mechanisms just work. And be it in the gray area or in the dark area or in the white area where it just makes economic sense, there will be pioneers, and it might take a long time, but we will get there eventually, that these new mechanisms are just more powerful.
No, that's fascinating, and I see both Chenny and Silko scribbling away furiously there. So I'm sure they have a lot to say on this topic. So we're winding down to the last moments, but we're going to leave some room for Q&A. So please have your questions prepped. But I guess keeping on Facebook Meta for a second, because you mentioned Libra, Henning. What gives that Facebook changed their name to Meta specifically because they want to be known as, I guess, the keepers of the metaverse. But they did not successfully launch Libra. In fact, what's happened with Libra is the Move programming language, which is what underlies Libra, that was invented at Facebook. And it continues to be a really solid, robust, fast programming language that the teams within Libra agree are worth keeping. I mean, they invented it, but they also agree it's worth keeping. It's worth taking out of Facebook. It's an open source project, so they take it out of Facebook and then continue this project of developing on top of this protocol. So on the one hand, it illustrates really well that you have this corporation that wants to be a part of the metaverse. However, the keepers of the metaverse just could not exist within this organization, and instead they've taken the technology out of it and splintered to do interesting things with it. I mean, it's really interesting to think about that dichotomy, and I wonder what that signifies about the future of DAOs and who controls DAOs ultimately. But Tony, Silka, I'm sure you guys have some thoughts.
Well, okay, so this dichotomy you're talking about is between essentially control and...
Yeah, exactly. So in other words, so Facebook had the capital resources to hire talent to build the Move programming language, but it could not make the project Libra succeed. I
think this speaks to some of the tensions between sort of data ownership and sort of control of that sort of underlying code base.
Yeah.
Like one of the, I think, interesting things when it comes to something like a Libra is this idea that you can fundamentally track where all of the money goes. And this is kind of part of this notional layer of transparency around sort of cryptocurrencies generally. That, when paired with the idea that like Facebook is also knowing everything that you're reading and seeing, and as well as what you're buying, was like a step too far, I guess, on a sort of philosophical control and ownership basis, and they step back from that. But I think it's really interesting just to think about this sort of dichotomy between transparency and privacy when it comes to crypto, when we're starting to think about criminality and regulation. Because one of the great things about blockchain generally is it's a form of extensible regulation. As a regulator, if you're able to fully embrace what is possible here with smart contracts that are embedded within composable enterprises that are actually at runtime or at compile time, actually checking whether policy is being followed. And this is the case, particularly with privacy. We heard about a new standard being developed by a group called FIDES through DAZ's group. But these kinds of modalities of computational law where you're getting extensible regulation extending through the ecosystem, this sort of opens the space for thinking about, okay, where are we right now in terms of transparency over money flows? How is it that Elon Musk is saying Putin is 10 times richer than him? We're seeing a whole bunch of things coming out from the Panama Papers, Pandora Papers, that speak to the existing way that law has enabled secrecy to be pretty much fundamental to the way that the wealthiest people in the world currently operate. And so crypto, when we start sort of looking at crypto, okay, yes, there's a privacy angle. People want to be able to maybe do what Putin does. Maybe everybody should be able to do that. Or maybe we're kind of saying, well, hang on a minute. We have nation states. We have these agreed democratic principles and frameworks for what it means to actually pay taxes and not engage in criminal activity. And maybe it's okay to have a certain level of fundamental transparency around that level of control. And from the employment and tax paying perspective, maybe there are certain kinds of benevolent intermediaries, maybe they're states, maybe they're nonprofits or civic actors in some sense, who are able to provide that level of transparency when it's necessary for a state when it comes to criminality, but otherwise is fully protecting that sort of privacy and ability to act, without that surveillance state or surveillance capitalism sort of looking over your shoulder. And so it's interesting, what are the use cases for privacy that are ethical and appropriate, and otherwise, how do we then sort of lean into that sort of transparency that can sort of allow extensible regulation and sort of reduce that sort of background criminality that has maybe led us into this war and peace scenario right now.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So we have time for one more comment. So if anyone wants the last word on this.
Yeah, I would love to highlight one point, and how DAO mechanism can revolutionize the creative process by artists and their fans, right? And we all know previously for example, music fans, they are passive consumers, right? And no matter how much they spend on music, no matter how much they contribute to the community, they will not, first of all, they will not be attributed. Second of all, they will not be financially rewarded at all, right? So if we can use DAO combined with NFT to mobilize fan bases, we can have a new landscape of creative process, right? And each kind of contribution to the creative community, either time, right, influence, or even their music taste, will be rewarded through DAO, right? And they are allowed to create these derivative works, and their derivative works will be freely distributed and financially rewarded. That will be a fantastic future for artists and their fans, right? But right now, I have to say, some of the copyright licenses are in the way to this bright future, right? And recently, a friend of mine actually came to me ask actually why Lava Labs, the creator of the CryptoPunks, right? Why Lava Labs were able to sell CryptoPunks collection to Yuga Labs, the creator of Bored Apes, right? And he thought actually users like himself has already bought CryptoPunks from Lava Labs. Then I had to explain to him that when users bought CryptoPunks, they bought no IP rights, and basically nothing more than a JPG file and the right to brag about it, right? So, an NFT actually essentially is a series of digital digits on blockchain referring to the ownership of digital assets or other entitlements, right? In other words, NFT is a certificate of entitlement, which, however, does not necessarily grant the holder any entitlement at all. It sounds confusing, but let me give an example, right? So this is similar to the situation where you buy an antique marriage certificate as a collectible. But it doesn't mean that you get to marry any person on a certificate, right? So basically, the rights users receive from NFTs depend on the legal contracts underneath smart contracts, right? So I just want to highlight that, recently, Yuga Labs bought CryptoPunks and applied a more liberal corporate license to Cyberpunks as well, right? And according to Yuga Labs, they actually grant both personal license and commercial licenses for users, right? And including a right to create derivative works. And based on the performance of Bored Apes, I believe this is going to be the future of NFTs. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Professor Leo. I don't know how much more the world needs Bored Apes or CryptoPunks, but that's my snobbish taste. So, awesome. Well, I mean, this has been a fantastic discussion, so thank you to all our panelists. I do want to leave room for a Q&A, so we have about 10 minutes before the next item on the agenda, but do we have microphones for the audience? Or okay, great, thank you. Yes, so this gentleman here.
Am I louder here? Algorithmically managed DAOs or something to that. It's algorithmically managed, I believe. Now, all my experience in DAOs has been people managed, a group chat with a Gnosis multi-sig, right? What is it that Wyoming is trying to achieve with that, or what is the view with algorithmically managed? Because I've not seen this play out as of yet.
Yeah, so thank you in the name of Wyoming to allow me to clarify this. I mean, Wyoming is awesome. I mean, they create a law, and they know exactly that they're gonna improve it half a year later. That's the opposite of how a big country or the European Union creates law. And that was just a fuck up, because what they wanted to express is just, yeah, that's the smart contract somehow. And specifically for Wyoming, there are things you can do with a DAO that you would not really be able to do, probably people think, with the LLC law itself, because you would not be allowed for an LLC to give over enough control to something that is this algorithm. And so they wrote language where the algorithmic part was in it, more or less to clarify, okay, so now with the DAO LLC law, you can do this. It's going to be allowable. And then they created language where it was not clear anymore. Can you now have a management managed LLC or just a member managed LLC? What's the difference in the first place? And that was where it went wrong. And it wasn't really intended to make this difference. It was just intended to make clear you can do all of this. And you can basically, I'm paraphrasing this, and it might be totally wrong, but that's my understanding. You can do all of this stuff now that you can do in an LLC, and you can also make it be programmed in a smart contract. And that's where this algorithmic came from, to make clear that is one of the core differences. Does that help?
I think that helps.
Yeah. And DAZA,
yeah, just to reference what I understand from DAZA is that they made the change subsequently so that you could close it down if there wasn't human judgment in the loop. That's still in the process? Okay, well, legislation, done agilely.
I think it's awesome. I mean, that's...
Over on the side.
Yeah, so the last panel was talking about, and Larry specifically was talking about how business models are eating law. So just kind of quickly, I'd be interested to hear, what some of these new business models, like which ones are the most exciting to you in the DAO space now. Maybe each person can give like one example of like an exciting business law innovation in the DAO space that they recommend everybody, have as a homework assignment to go look up and see how we can embed this in the future that we all want.
Maybe I can jump in so that my example doesn't get taken by someone else. I recently got introduced to something called Coordinate, which is this sort of visualization for how tokens can be distributed within a collective. And it's this sort of currently beautiful 2D visualization, but essentially you're looking at the voluntary recognition economy within a collective. And everybody's given a sort of, say, 100 tokens to distribute however they want to other people within the collective. And then the end of that month or whatever epoch you're looking at, you can sort of visualize and see that. And then those sort of voluntarily sort of given tokens can be assigned to, a bonus pool or like ownership or governance or something like that. But crucially, you're able to see what everybody has given to everybody else. And so you're sort of creating this more dynamic sense of an economy within your collective. And it's almost like, how do we improve on the sort of collective Markov blanket? You're sort of sensing and predicting based upon this sort of additional information. And you're also able to see when people are somewhat gaming the system. Because, if I gave all the 100 to you and you gave your whole 100 back to me, it's sort of very clear that we're sort of like trying to game that. And so, it's sort of like it's not a business model per se, but it sort of starts speaking to how we start recognizing different signifiers of value. Care and compassion, within a community is often seen as like invisible economy work, and starting to visualize some of these other signifiers of value that we want to start acknowledging is kind of like part of some of the interesting stuff that can be done. Honestly, there.
What I find very interesting is at the moment is the universal basic income projects that use DAOs, or there's, for example, one project called Circles. And not circles. And what they do is in order to be in a system, you need 3 people that trust you. The interesting fact about that is, if you trust someone, the person can use all your money. So that basically keeps the circle usually relatively small. But it does create quite a nice universal basic income economy worldwide, globally, using that currency.
Thanks, Ilka. So, Henning, Professor Leo, I've just been given the minute warning, so 30 seconds each, please.
Okay, I'm most interested in 2 extremes. One is the vanilla DAO that is just having the minimal operating agreement as an LLC programmed as a smart contract. That's already incredibly powerful and the starting point for a lot of things. And the other is that I think the question that we had in the previous panel, can the surveillance economy and surveillance capitalism be revolutionized so that we separate out the ownership of privacy data that is incredibly harmful. And I think people underestimate by a long margin how harmful that is in the state of affairs we have now. That can separate that out from the beneficial rights that accrue income to the collector of not the data then, but maybe some handle to the data that itself remains protected. And this is a very complex, it's on the opposite side of the spectrum, it's very complex, but it can be done, and it will allow lawmakers in the long run, and even in the medium term, to completely outlaw the excesses that we now have in capitalism surveillance. So that's what I'm very interested in, and a DAO will be needed for that.
Thanks, Henning.
Yeah, a typical DAO in the creative area is, again, Bored Ape Yacht Club, right? Bored Ape Yacht Club, right? First of all, although they might not necessarily call them a DAO, but they serve all the functionalities of a DAO. First of all, right, all the holders chip in money, right? It's a typical crowdfunding functionality of a DAO, right? Second of all, each Bored Ape holder can create derivative works and explore commercially those derivative works, right? This is actually the so-called crowdsourcing functionality, and they also have right to vote for the future commercial exploitations for those monkeys, right? And I heard that they have voted to first of all build a band, music band. Consist of all those monkeys, right? And they're gonna shoot a movie based on those apes, and they're gonna develop a video game based on these apes, right? And so I think this is so far the most successful DAO in the creative area. But I think we can actually go a step further, right? Because all ape holders, they are not really IP co-owners. They're just licensees, right? And how about we create a DAO that allowed all the NFT holders become co-owners of IP? That would be the next step.
Thanks, Professor Liu. All right, so if you could join me real quick in thanking our panelists for their amazing insights.